The rain drummed against the tin roof of the Ebenezer Baptist Church with a relentless rhythm. It was a heavy mourning sound that seemed to echo the hollowness in my chest. I stood alone in the vestibule, my fingers tracing the worn edge of my black suit jacket. For 40 years, Hattie had been the one to straighten my tie and tell me I looked handsome. Now there was only the smell of old wood floor wax and the damp air of a Savannah morning. Hattie was a woman of grace, a schoolteacher who could calm a room with a single look and heal a heart with a bowl of her famous shrimp and grits. She was the steady heartbeat of our home, the one who kept the faith when the world outside felt cold. I looked at my hands, the skin dark and thick with calluses that never quite faded. I remembered the 30 years I spent down at the shipyards, working triple shifts until my back felt like it would snap. I did it all for them. I swallowed the salt air and the exhaustion so my boys could have the best. I wanted them to have clean fingernails and degrees on their walls. I wanted them to be the men I never had the chance to be. But as I stood there waiting, I felt the weight of those 30 years pressing down on me like a debt that would never be repaid. The heavy oak doors finally creaked open, but it was not the quiet entrance of grieving sons. Dante walked in first, his silk suit shimmering under the dim yellow lights of the sanctuary. He was checking his gold watch, his eyes darting around as if he had 100 better places to be. Xavier followed right behind him, looking bored and tapping at his phone screen with a restless thumb. They did not come to me for a hug. They did not even look at the framed photograph of their mother sitting near the altar. Then came Tiana, Dante's wife. She stepped inside and immediately pulled a silk handkerchief from her designer purse to cover her nose. She looked around the sacred space with a sneer. She said that this place smelled like mold and old people. She complained that the rain was going to ruin her $100 hairstyle. There was no prayer on her lips, only a sharp tongue that cut through the silence of my grief. To them, I was no longer a father or a provider. I was just a tired old man sitting on a pile of assets they were waiting to inherit. I was a financial burden, a relic of a time they wanted to forget. The conflict was silent but heavy, a storm brewing inside the house of God. The choir was halfway through a low and mournful rendition of Precious Lord when my phone began to vibrate against my thigh. It was a violent and persistent intrusion into the sacred music. I looked down and saw the name Otis flashing on the screen. Otis was the contractor I had hired to fix the plumbing and the drywall at the small brick office where Hattie had spent her afternoons grading papers. I pressed the phone to my ear and heard his breath coming in short and ragged gasps. He told me that I needed to get there right away. He said his voice was shaking and he sounded like he had seen a ghost. He told me to bring my sons because there was something hidden in the bones of the building that did not belong. I stood up and signaled for Dante and Xavier to follow me. We walked out of the church, and the cold rain hit my face like a slap. As we piled into the car, I expected a somber silence or a question about what was wrong. Instead, the air inside the vehicle became thick with greed. Dante gripped the steering wheel and started talking about the market value of the property before we even cleared the parking lot. He said that the neighborhood was changing and that the office sat on a gold mine. He told Xavier that they should knock the building down and put up a luxury apartment complex with 20 units. Xavier laughed and said that he wanted a piece of that deal because he needed the cash to cover some bad investments. They started shouting over each other about square footage and zoning laws and interest rates. It was as if their mother was not even dead. It was as if we were not driving to the place where she had spent her life serving the community. I sat in the back seat and felt my heart tighten until it was a hard and painful knot in my chest. Their words were like sharp stones being thrown at my soul. I looked out the window at the passing gray streets and realized that my sons did not see a sanctuary of memories. They only saw a pile of bricks and a chance to get rich. The cruelty of their ambition was a poison that filled the small space of the car, and I struggled to breathe as we turned the corner toward the office. Otis stood by the heavy oak bookshelf with his face as pale as a sheet of paper. He pointed a trembling finger toward a gap where the wood had been pried away from the plaster. Behind the shelf lay a narrow doorway that led into a cramped, windowless room that none of us knew existed. I stepped inside and the air felt thick and heavy, like it had been trapped for 100 years. The walls were lined with metal filing cabinets and stacks of manila folders piled high on a small wooden desk. In the center of the floor sat a heavy black iron safe with a silver dial that caught the dim light. It looked cold and immovable, like a dark secret waiting to be told. My mind raced back to the woman I had shared a bed with for 40 years. Hattie was a history teacher who loved the truth above all else. She was the kind of woman who left her journals open on the kitchen table and never whispered when she spoke. She was steady and calm and honest to a fault. I could not understand why a woman with nothing to hide would build a fortress behind a wall. The realization that I did not know everything about my own wife felt like a physical blow to my chest. I wondered what kind of fear could have driven a gentle soul like Hattie to create such a hidden place. The silence was shattered when Dante pushed past me with a wild look in his eyes. He reached out and grabbed a heavy sledgehammer from the tool belt Otis had left on the floor. He swung the hammer onto his shoulder and prepared to strike the safe with all his might. He shouted that there was probably a fortune in cash or jewelry hidden inside, and he was not going to wait another minute to find out. Tiana stood right behind him, and her eyes were glowing with a hungry light as she muttered about a secret treasure that would solve all their problems. She was already spending the money in her head before the door was even open. I stepped forward and placed my hand firmly on the handle of the hammer. I told Dante to put the tool down, in a voice that was quiet but hard as granite. I felt a wave of cold dread wash over me as I looked at that safe. This was not a chest of gold or a collection of diamonds. This felt like a warning. I told them that we would do this the right way, or we would not do it at all. Dante sneered at me and called me a paranoid old man, but he finally let go of the hammer. I stood there in the shadows of the secret room, and I knew in my soul that whatever was behind that iron door would change our lives forever. Dante stepped toward the safe with a look of arrogant confidence. He claimed that he had seen a scrap of paper in Tiana's purse weeks ago with a string of numbers that matched her birth date. He knelt on the dusty floor and began to turn the silver dial with practiced precision. He entered the month, the day, and the year of his wife's birth. A heavy metallic click echoed through the small room, and the iron door swung open with a groan of neglected hinges. My blood ran cold at the sight. I could not understand why Hattie would ever use Tiana's birthday as a key to her most private sanctuary. Hattie had never been close to Tiana. She always treated the girl with a polite but distant kindness. This choice of numbers was not an act of affection. It was a cold and calculated breadcrumb left for me to find. It was a signal that Hattie knew her enemies were closer than I ever dared to imagine. The interior of the safe was not filled with the stacks of $100 bills or the velvet jewelry boxes that my sons expected. There were no gold coins or property deeds spread across the metal shelf. Instead, there was only a small black plastic thumb drive and a single sheet of yellowed notebook paper. I reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the letter. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Hattie's elegant and upright script, but the ink was smeared in places, as if she had been rushing or crying. The words burned into my eyes as I read them. She wrote that I must not trust anyone, not even the flesh and blood we had raised together. She said that they had pushed her into the darkness and that the walls were closing in on her. The air in the room suddenly felt like it was being sucked out by a vacuum. Dante and Xavier stared into the empty safe with expressions of pure rage. Xavier kicked a stack of old files and cursed loudly, shouting that they had wasted their time for a useless piece of plastic. Tiana hissed that the old woman must have hidden the real money somewhere else in the office. They began to tear through the room like a pack of starving wolves. They ripped open cardboard boxes and dumped Hattie's precious teaching records onto the floor. They threw her old history books against the wall and shredded folders filled with decades of student memories. They were looking for gold, but they were trampling over the soul of the woman who gave them life. I stood there, clutching the small thumb drive against my palm, feeling the sharp edges dig into my skin. I realized in that moment that the sons I thought I knew were gone, replaced by monsters wearing the faces of my children. I sat in the darkness of my living room with the small plastic drive plugged into my laptop. The house was silent, but the air felt charged with a static energy that made the hair on my arms stand up. I clicked the first audio file, and the sound of Hattie's voice filled the room. She sounded weak, and her breath was shallow, but her words were sharp enough to cut through my soul. She spoke about the day she looked at our joint savings account and realized that $40,000 had vanished without a trace. She had tracked the withdrawals back to Dante. She said she confronted him in the kitchen, but he just laughed and told her she was getting old and confused. My heart hammered against my ribs as I listened to her describe how Tiana would come over every afternoon to help with her medicine. Hattie whispered into the microphone that she had caught Tiana in the bathroom, emptying the clear insulin from the vials and replacing it with plain salt water. The betrayal did not stop with the first son. I opened a second folder labeled Xavier and felt a new wave of nausea roll over me. There were scanned images of a life insurance policy I had never seen before. Xavier had forged Hattie's elegant signature on a document worth $500,000. He had listed himself as the sole beneficiary. There were also recordings of frantic phone calls from men with low and dangerous voices demanding payment for gambling debts that totaled over $100,000. Xavier had been selling his mother's life to pay for his own failures. He had been betting on the day she would take her last breath so he could clear his ledger with the shadows. The medical examiner had told me it was a simple case of heart failure brought on by age and stress. I realized now that the diagnosis was a lie. This was not a natural end. It was a slow and calculated execution carried out by the people we had loved and protected. They had starved her heart of the medicine it needed while they bled her dry of everything she owned. It was a sophisticated murder hidden behind the mask of family care. I looked at the wedding photo on the mantel and felt a rage so cold it felt like ice in my veins. My sons were not mourning their mother. They were celebrating a successful heist. I was the last obstacle standing between them and the rest of the empire I had built with my sweat and blood. I closed the laptop and sat in the shadows, knowing that the man who walked into that church this morning was dead. A soldier was waking up in his place. I knew that calling the police right then would be a mistake because a few digital files were not enough to prove a murder in a court of law. I needed them to feel safe so they would become careless. I decided to wear a mask of my own and become the helpless old man they already believed I was. I started the act the next morning when Dante and Tiana came by to check on the property papers. I sat at the kitchen table with a blank stare and let a spoonful of tomato soup dribble down the front of my clean white shirt. I pretended to struggle with the buttons on my sweater, and I called Dante by his uncle's name. I saw the way they exchanged a quick and wicked look of triumph. They thought my mind was finally rotting away, and that the stress of the funeral had snapped my sanity. The conflict grew sharper as the afternoon went on. I leaned back in my chair and watched them through half-closed eyes as they began to talk about me as if I were a piece of broken furniture. Tiana did not even bother to lower her voice when she said that I was becoming a disgusting mess. She laughed and told Dante that they needed to find a place for me before I burned the house down. They started looking at brochures for a state-run nursing home 3 states away in a town where they would never have to visit me. They spoke about the monthly cost being less than $1,000 and how that would leave more of the inheritance for their own pockets. They were plotting to exile me to a cold and lonely room while they moved into the house I had spent 40 years paying for. Xavier walked in and joined the conversation with a cruel grin on his face. He said that the dementia was a blessing because an old man who did not know his own name could not fight back in probate court. He joked about how easy it would be to guide my hand to sign the deed over to them. I had to grip the underside of the table until my knuckles turned white to keep from jumping up and striking the smiles off their faces. Every insulting word they spoke was a nail in the coffin of our relationship. I realized that they did not see a father who had sacrificed everything for them. They only saw a walking checkbook that was finally running out of ink. I let another string of soup fall from my lip and played my part to perfection, while my mind remained as sharp as a razor and twice as cold. I invited them all to the house for what I called the final settling of the estate. I told Dante and Xavier that my mind was too tired to carry the weight of the property anymore and that I was ready to sign everything over to them. They arrived at the front door with wide smiles and a false sense of concern that made my stomach churn. We sat down at the large mahogany dining table where Hattie used to serve Sunday dinner. I had cooked a pot of beef stew, and the steam rose into the air, but the atmosphere was cold and predatory. Tiana volunteered to make the tea, insisting that I needed to rest my weary bones. I watched her through the reflection in the polished silver hutch as she stood in the kitchen. She pulled a small blue vial from her pocket and emptied a thick liquid into the porcelain cup meant for me. She thought I was too far gone to notice the slight tremble in her hand or the way she glanced over her shoulder to see if I was looking. When she returned to the table, she set the cup down in front of me with a sweet and poisonous smile. She urged me to drink it while it was hot, saying it would help settle my nerves before we looked at the legal documents. Just as I reached for the handle, her phone began to ring loudly in the hallway. She cursed under her breath and stepped away to answer the call, thinking she had the situation under control. In one swift and silent motion, I swapped my tainted cup with her identical one. I sat back and waited for her to return my face a mask of senile confusion. When she sat down, she took a long and satisfied gulp of the tea she thought was hers, her eyes locking onto mine with a terrifying triumph. She was so eager to put me to sleep that she did not even taste the bitterness of her own medicine. While we waited for the supposed lawyer to arrive, they began to strip the room of its history. They did not even wait for me to close my eyes. Dante took Hattie's silver candlesticks and began to weigh them in his hands, talking about the price of scrap metal. Xavier went to the mantel and grabbed the hand-carved clock that my grandfather had given us for our wedding. He laughed and said it was an antique that would fetch a few $1,000s at the auction house downtown. They moved through the house like a pack of starving vultures picking at a fresh carcass. They argued over the Persian rugs and the crystal vases, dividing up 40 years of memories as if they were nothing but junk. I watched them through the large mirror on the wall, seeing their true faces twisted by a hunger for gold. They were laughing at my silence, unaware that the trap was already set and that the hunter was watching their every move with a heart of stone. The doorbell rang precisely at 7 o'clock in the evening. I stood up with a slow and calculated effort, playing my role until the very last second. Attorney Sterling walked in first, his briefcase heavy with the weight of the truth. Behind him were two tall men in plain suits, whom I introduced as my old friends from the shipyards. Dante and Xavier barely looked up from the piles of jewelry and documents they were sorting. They were too drunk on their own greed to notice the cold and professional way those two men scanned the room. Tiana began to sway in her chair, her eyes fluttering as the sedative she had intended for me started to cloud her own mind. I walked over to the television in the corner and picked up a remote control that was connected to a small hidden lens I had installed above the stove. The screen flickered to life, and the room fell into a deathly silence. The high-definition footage showed Tiana standing in my kitchen just 20 minutes ago. We all watched as she pulled the blue vial from her pocket and carefully poisoned the tea. Dante leaped to his feet, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. Before he could speak, I pressed another button, and the final recording of Hattie filled the house. Her voice was a ghostly whisper naming each of them and describing how they had systematically drained her life and her bank accounts. She spoke of the forged signatures and the stolen insulin with a clarity that stripped away every lie they had ever told. The two undercover officers stepped forward and produced their badges, their faces grim and unforgiving. The betrayal turned inward as soon as the handcuffs appeared on the table. Dante began to scream at his younger brother, accusing Xavier of being the one who came up with the plan to forge the insurance papers. He shouted that he was only trying to protect the family legacy, while Xavier was flushing it down the drain with his gambling debts. Xavier barked back that Dante was a coward who let his wife do all the dirty work. Tiana collapsed onto her knees, sobbing and begging for mercy, claiming she only did it because she wanted a better life for our future grandchildren. I stood up and looked down at the wreckage of my own bloodline. My heart felt like a hollow chamber where a fire had once burned. I told them that blood did not mean loyalty, and that being a father did not mean being a victim. I watched as the officers led them out into the rainy night, their shadows stretching long and dark across the floor of the home they had tried to steal. The sound of the heavy metal car doors slamming shut echoed through the quiet street like a final judgment. I stood on the porch and watched the flashing blue and red lights fade into the distance. Dante and Tiana were pressed against the back seat in handcuffs, their faces twisted with a mix of terror and disbelief. Xavier was left standing by his car, his hands trembling as he realized that the financial ruins of his life were finally catching up to him. He was facing a mountain of legal debt and the cold reality that his father would no longer be his safety net. I felt a strange sense of stillness wash over me. The house was empty now, but for the first time in a month, it did not feel haunted by lies. A few days later, I drove out to the cemetery to visit Hattie. The grass was green, and the air smelled like jasmine and fresh earth. I stood before her headstone and told her that the truth was finally out in the open. I had made some difficult choices in the wake of the trial. I decided to sell the large family house and the office building. I used most of the money to pay off the debts my sons had created, and I donated the remaining $200,000 to a scholarship fund for students at Hattie's old school. I was no longer a wealthy man by the standards of the world. My bank account was nearly empty, and I had moved into a small one-bedroom apartment near the park. Yet as I touched the cold marble of her grave, my heart felt lighter than it had in 40 years. I was poor in pocket, but rich in peace. The following morning, I woke up before the rest of the world. I brewed a pot of tea and took a single mug out to the small wooden porch of my new home. There was no one there to judge my movements or plot against my life. I sat in my favorite rocking chair and watched as the first light of the sun began to bleed across the horizon in shades of orange and deep purple. I realized that my life was starting over at 69 years old. I was no longer living for the expectations of ungrateful children or the shadows of the past. I was living for the truth and for the woman who had died to make sure I saw it. I took a slow and steady sip of my tea, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. I looked at the rising sun, and I felt a quiet strength building in my bones. I was ready for whatever tomorrow had to offer, because I was finally a free man. The most profound lesson from Elijah's journey is that our worth is not measured by the legacy we leave in our children's pockets, but by the peace we preserve in our own souls. Blood may connect us by birth, but only character and integrity bind us by heart. Life becomes truly valuable when we stop lighting ourselves on fire to keep others warm, especially those who are waiting for us to turn into ash. True freedom begins the moment you realize that protecting your peace is a sacred duty, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to walk away from toxic bonds to embrace the truth.